Two armies. Dawn, a muddy plain stretching between them. Thousands of men, weapons drawn, breath fogging in the cold air. They don't attack. Not yet. It's not fear, it's not confusion, it's not a failed charge or a broken formation. It's a rule. Medieval warfare had rules. Written codes, unwritten agreements, protocols that both sides honored, sometimes even in the middle of slaughter. Rules about who you could kill, who you couldn't. Rules about what day of the week you were allowed to fight. Rules about how long a castle had to hold before its garrison could surrender with honor. Some of these rules will make you laugh. Some will make your jaw drop. One of them, if you think about it long enough, will make you question everything you think you know about how civilization actually works. All of them were real. These are 7 of them. Here's the thing most people get wrong about medieval warfare. They imagine it as pure chaos, two mobs of men hacking at each other until one side ran out of people. It wasn't. Medieval war was governed by 3 interlocking forces: the chivalric code, a set of obligations binding knights to certain standards of conduct; the ransoming economy, a financial system that made capturing enemies more valuable than killing them; and the church, which claimed authority over when, where, and against whom Christian soldiers were permitted to fight. These 3 forces didn't make war kinder, they made it stranger. They produced a battlefield culture so elaborate, so specific, so counterintuitive, that reading about it now feels like studying the rules of a sport that no longer exists. The rules didn't make war kinder, they made it stranger. Rule number 1. Heralds were untouchable. All wars, all sides. The rule was absolute. If a man rode into your camp carrying a herald's staff, a white rod, or a banner displaying the enemy's colors, you did not touch him. You fed him, you sheltered him, you listened to whatever message he carried, and then you let him walk back out, unharmed, through a battlefield that minutes earlier had been full of men trying to kill each other. This wasn't sentiment, it wasn't mercy, it was infrastructure. Heralds were the medieval world's communication network. They carried surrender terms between armies, they arranged truces so the dead could be collected before they rotted in summer heat. They negotiated ransom prices for captured knights. They identified bodies on the battlefield when armor made faces unrecognizable. Without heralds, the entire apparatus of medieval warfare, the negotiations, the terms, the financial transactions, simply stopped functioning. At Agincourt in 1415, French and English heralds crossed back and forth between the lines while the battle was still being fought. Men were dying 50 meters away, and 2 messengers in opposing colors walked past each other, nodded, and continued their respective errands. Here's what most people miss about this rule. It wasn't just an agreement between gentlemen, it was enforced by consequence. A commander who killed a herald became someone no one would negotiate with. Truces wouldn't be offered, ransoms wouldn't be paid, surrender terms wouldn't be extended. You didn't just commit a moral violation, you opted yourself out of the entire system that made war survivable. The herald was untouchable not because he was respected, he was untouchable because killing him cost more than he was worth. The lesson? Information was power. Kill the messenger and you killed your own intelligence network and your chance of ever getting your men back alive. Rule number 2. You don't kill a noble, you invoice him. 14th century. A dead knight paid nothing, a living knight paid everything. This single financial reality shaped the entire culture of medieval aristocratic warfare. Killing a captured enemy nobleman wasn't just wasteful, it was economically illiterate. A living lord was an asset. His family would pay. His king would pay. His estate would be sold, mortgaged, stripped to its foundations if necessary to get him back. The ransom system had a price list. Common soldiers at the bottom, little value, usually killed or enslaved. Knights in the middle, worth several years of a normal man's income. great lords at the top worth cities. Kings were essentially priceless. In 1356, at the Battle of Poitiers, the Black Prince, Edward of Woodstock, son of Edward III of England, captured King John II of France in the field. John was taken back to London, housed in relative comfort, treated as a guest rather than a prisoner, and eventually ransomed for 3 million gold écus. To put that in perspective, France's annual royal revenue at the time was roughly 450,000 écus. The ransom was nearly 7 years of the entire kingdom's income. France raised what it could and sent John home with an installment. When the payments stopped, John, bound by honor, voluntarily returned to captivity in London. He died there in 1364, still technically a prisoner, still technically paying. That's not a story about chivalry. That's a story about a financial instrument so powerful it could imprison a king for 8 years without a single guard needed. Here's the detail that haunts me about this rule. The system created perverse incentives at every level. Knights in battle would sometimes refuse to kill an obviously wealthy opponent, trying instead to force a surrender. 2 knights fighting over the right to claim a single prisoner because the prisoner was worth a fortune was not an uncommon sight. War had a price list, and kings were at the top. The lesson? Medieval warfare was partly an economy. The rules of engagement weren't mercy, they were profit margins. Honor and finance turned out to be the same thing.
Rule number 3. Sunday was off limits, 10th through 14th century. The church looked at medieval warfare and made a decision. It couldn't stop it, but maybe it could schedule it. The Truce of God, formalized by church councils beginning in the late 10th century, prohibited fighting on Sundays, on major religious feast days, and during the holy seasons of Advent and Lent. The logic was explicit. These were sacred times, consecrated to God, and the shedding of Christian blood during them was a desecration. On paper, at peak enforcement, this left roughly 80 days per year available for actual warfare. 80 days. That's all they had. The enforcement mechanism wasn't an army, it was excommunication. A commander who violated the Truce of God could be cast out of the church, which in the medieval period meant something close to social death. No sacraments, no burial in consecrated ground, potentially no loyalty from troops who feared the spiritual consequences of following an excommunicated lord. Sieges were paused and resumed on liturgical calendars. Campaigning seasons were planned around feast days. Armies that had spent weeks maneuvering for position would simply stop on a Saturday night and wait, sometimes within sight of each other, for Monday morning. And here's the fact that makes this rule genuinely astonishing. It worked. Not perfectly, not always, but the Truce of God was observed often enough across enough conflicts that it constituted the first internationally recognized humanitarian law in Western history. Centuries before the Geneva Convention, centuries before the concept of war crimes existed in any legal framework, the church didn't just offer spiritual comfort to soldiers, it functioned as a ceasefire mechanism, the only institution with enough cross-border authority to make warring kingdoms pause. The lesson? Rules without enforcers can still work, if breaking them costs more than following them. The Truce of God had no army, it had something more powerful, the thing every medieval commander feared more than death.
Rule number 4. A siege had an expiry date. Medieval Europe, 11th to 15th century. 40 days. If your castle held out for 40 days without a relief force arriving, you could surrender with full honor. No execution, no enslavement, no punishment for resistance. Your garrison walked away, alive, free, weapons sometimes returned. This rule was so widely observed, so deeply embedded in the culture of medieval warfare, that defenders literally counted the days. Scratches on dungeon walls, marks on parchment. The 40-day countdown was not metaphor, it was calculation. Here's why the rule existed. Sieges were expensive, catastrophically, ruinously expensive.
An army sitting outside a castle wasn't fighting, it wasn't raiding, it was eating, consuming food, supplies, horses, morale, while producing nothing. Medieval armies had no reliable supply chains. They foraged, which meant destroying the very territory they were trying to control. A siege that stretched into months could bankrupt a campaign before the walls ever fell. The 40-day rule gave both sides an exit. The attacker knew that a determined defense wouldn't last forever. The defender knew that holding out had a defined endpoint and a survivable one. This made surrender a rational calculation rather than a humiliation. The psychological effect on defenders was profound. 40 days wasn't just a rule, it was a reason to fight. Hold the walls, keep the gates shut, count the days, survive. The guarantee of honorable surrender if no relief came didn't make men surrender faster, it made them fight harder because they knew what the reward for endurance looked like. Contrast that with what happened when commanders ignored the rule. When a garrison that had fought honorably was executed anyway, as happened at several sieges during the 100 Years' War, the consequences rippled forward. Every subsequent garrison in every subsequent siege fought to the last man because surrender offered nothing. The rule didn't just protect defenders, it made future attacks cheaper by making surrender a viable option. The lesson? Honor had a countdown, and that countdown made both sides fight more predictably, which, in a world without clear laws, was the closest thing to safety available. Rule number 5. Looting had a pecking order. Agincourt, 1415. After the battle ended, when the dead stopped moving and the survivors started looking, you might think what came next was chaos. It wasn't. Plunder had a hierarchy as rigid as the military structure that had just won the battle. The commander claimed first, valuable prisoners, significant arms, the enemy's treasury if it had been captured. Then knights, claiming their own prisoners and the equipment of the men they'd personally defeated. Then infantry, working through whatever was left. Violating the order wasn't just frowned upon, it was punishable by death. At Agincourt in 1415, Henry V executed men for unauthorized looting while the battle was still being fought. Think about what that means. The field was still contested, men were still dying, and Henry stopped, identified soldiers who had broken rank to plunder, and had them killed mid-battle as a warning to the rest. This was not cruelty for its own sake, it was operational logic. An army that looted without order wasn't an army, it was a mob. Soldiers who broke formation to grab valuables left gaps in the line. They became separated from their units. They became distracted at the exact moment when discipline determined survival. Every unauthorized looter was a potential hole in your defense, a potential trigger for a rout, a potential reason the battle you were winning suddenly stopped going your way. The looting hierarchy also served a second function. It kept men loyal across campaigns. If you knew that your service entitled you to a defined share of the proceeds, that the system would pay you out in proportion to your rank and contribution, you had a reason to come back, to follow orders, to stay in formation even when breaking it looked profitable. Even thieves had rank, and that rank was the reason armies stayed together long enough to win. The lesson? Discipline over chaos, every time. The armies that looted systematically stayed together for the next campaign. The armies that looted freely fell apart. Order wasn't just a moral preference, it was the difference between a force and a rabble. Rule number 6. Burning villages was official policy. France, 1346 to 1347. This is the rule that doesn't sound like a rule at all. It sounds like atrocity. Chevauchée, the deliberate, systematic destruction of enemy territory, burning villages, slaughtering livestock, destroying crops, terrorizing civilians, wasn't a breakdown of order. It was doctrine. It had a name, a purpose, and a strategic logic so cold it reads like a manual. The target wasn't the enemy army. The target was the enemy king's legitimacy. Here's how it worked. A medieval king's primary obligation to his nobles and his people was protection. That was the contract. You gave him taxes and military service, he kept you safe. Chevauchée was designed to demonstrate, publicly and unmistakably, that he couldn't. A foreign army riding through your heartland, burning your villages, killing your people, and riding away unchallenged didn't just cause destruction. It broadcast a message to every baron, every peasant, and every neighboring power watching. This king cannot protect his own land. In 1346 and 1347, Edward III of England rode through France with an army whose explicit purpose was not to fight Philip VI. It was to humiliate him. Edward's forces burned a strip of northern France stretching hundreds of miles. They weren't trying to hold territory. They weren't sieging cities. They were performing. The performance worked. Philip, under unbearable pressure to respond, eventually chased Edward into a battle at Crécy, on terrain Edward had chosen, at a moment Edward had prepared for, and lost catastrophically. The Chevauchée hadn't just burned villages, it had lured a king into a catastrophic tactical error by attacking his pride instead of his army. Here's the detail that makes this rule genuinely disturbing. It was efficient. It was cheaper than pitched battle. It required less coordination. It produced results, political, psychological, strategic, that armies 3 times the size couldn't guarantee. The cruelest rule on this list was also the most coldly logical. They didn't come to fight armies, they came to break kingdoms. The lesson? Legitimacy was always the real target. Burn enough villages and you don't just destroy property, you destroy the story a king tells about himself. And once that story breaks, armies tend to follow. Rule number 7. Armies sometimes chose the battlefield together. Medieval Europe. 2 armies, 1 letter, a date circled on a calendar. It sounds like fiction. It wasn't. Major pitched battles in medieval Europe were sometimes, not always, but often enough to constitute a pattern, negotiated in advance. Location agreed upon, date confirmed. Both sides showed up. The custom stretched across centuries of warfare in France, England, and the German states, a reflection of a deeper truth about medieval war. That pitched battle was theater as much as it was violence. The logic ran like this. A pitched battle was a massive, irreversible event, one that could decide dynasties, redistribute territory, and change the political map of a continent in a single afternoon. Both sides needed it to be legible, to God, who was watching and whose favor determined the outcome, to their own nobles, who needed to believe the fight was righteous, to history, which would remember who stood where and why. A battle that happened because one side surprised the other in a river crossing was a skirmish. A battle that happened because both sides chose the ground, chose the day, and showed up ready. That was a judgment. That was God deciding. During the 100 Years' War, there are documented instances of both sides selecting terrain mutually, of commanders exchanging letters about suitable fields, of battles that were delayed not because one side wasn't ready, but because the location under consideration wasn't considered honorable ground for the engagement being planned. Here's what makes this the strangest rule on this list. Medieval armies didn't just agree on where to fight, they agreed on when to start. Heralds crossed the field. Hours were negotiated. A charge before the signal was given was considered, genuinely, seriously considered, a breach of honor, regardless of whether it worked. 2 armies could stand within arrow range of each other, fully armed, fully ready, and simply not begin, because beginning without being invited to was somehow the wrong way to start a battle. The violence was permitted, the impatience was not. We look at that and see absurdity. They looked at it and saw civilization. Medieval war, at its strangest, looked like a duel between nations. The lesson? Civilization isn't the absence of violence, it's the presence of agreed-upon rules about when violence starts and what it means when it ends. Medieval armies saw the alternative. They called it barbarism. They weren't wrong. The pattern. 7 rules. 7 moments where medieval warfare stopped looking like chaos and started looking like something else entirely. Something almost rational. Here's the thing that connects all of them. None of these rules existed because medieval people were noble. They weren't. The same culture that honored heralds burned villages. The same knights who paid ransoms tortured prisoners. The same church that enforced Sunday truces blessed armies marching to slaughter. These rules existed because war without rules isn't just brutal, it's expensive, it's unpredictable. It's impossible to sustain across years and decades and generations. Armies that kill messengers can't negotiate. Armies that kill nobles instead of ransoming them run out of money. Armies that loot without order fall apart before the next campaign. The rules weren't imposed from outside, they were generated from inside, by the logic of a system trying to sustain itself. They were the warfare equivalent of immune responses, the body of medieval war protecting itself from its own worst impulses. Not because the impulses were wrong, because acting on them was bad for business. These rules didn't exist because medieval people were noble. They existed because war without rules is just destruction, and destruction doesn't build empires, it just ends them. The next time someone tells you medieval war was barbaric, ask them which part. The part where they let enemy messengers walk freely through their camp. The part where they housed captured kings as guests and negotiated payment plans for their release. The part where they observed international ceasefires on a liturgical calendar, without an enforcement mechanism beyond collective shame. We have the Geneva Convention. We have the International Criminal Court. We have satellite surveillance and war crimes tribunals and the entire architecture of modern humanitarian law. And we still struggle every decade to make warring parties honor rules that medieval knights observed because it was bad for business not to. They had rules we still haven't matched, not in their sophistication, in their compliance. If this changed how you think about medieval warfare, hit like. It takes 2 seconds and it genuinely helps. Subscribe if you want more of this, because we are just getting started. And tell me in the comments, which rule shocked you most, and which one do you think we should have kept? Also watch the 10 worst decisions by medieval kings that destroyed empires. These weren't weak men, these were emperors, warlords, the most powerful rulers on earth, and every single one of them destroyed everything they had in one decision. Don't miss it.